they do with the boats is have cocktail parties on them at the weekend. And in myriads of ways, you see, you go home, we're the wealthiest people in the world, and you would think that having earned your money and go home, you would have an orgy and a great banquet and so on, but nobody does. They eat a TV dinner, which is just a warmed-over airline food, and then they spend the evening looking at an electronic reproduction of life, which is divided from you by a glass screen. You can't touch it, you can't smell it, it has no color, except maybe if you're very wealthy it has color. But by and large it doesn't, and you look at this thing, and you have a strange feeling, you see, that the whole procession of grades that was leading to something in the future, to that goody, that gorgeous, voluptuous goody that was lying at the end of the line, it never quite turns up.
Welcome, fellow plebs. My name is Sean, and this is
Tribunus Plebis.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 17 of the Tribunus Plebis podcast. First thing is a few thoughts about the election that we all just suffered through. Let's start with acknowledging that Joe Biden will become president number 46 of the United States of America, and that Donald Trump, shitty racist monster that he is, will be, thankfully, gone. Biden has won the presidency, but the Democratic Party lost every other thing on the ticket. They lost House seats and most likely won't take the Senate. But we won't know the answer to that for a few months. And I will admit that if somehow they win both runoffs in Georgia and get that 51-50 split, that will change a few things in what I'm saying. But more importantly than all of that is that they will get absolutely slaughtered in the midterm elections, and Biden or Kamala will get absolutely freight trained in 4 years, unless they start doing things differently. They ran a shitty centrist Democrat who excited basically nobody. He was the author of the Clinton crime bill that destroyed so many lives over the decades and ballooned our prison system. He lied to get us into the Iraq War. He destroyed Anita Hill on live TV to help confirm psychopathically right-wing Clarence Thomas. And then there's the lying, the plagiarizing, the sexual assault allegations, the creepy sniffing of little girls' hair. And then, in a year of the entire country screaming, "Fuck the police," he chose a cop as a running mate. And that cop is about as neoliberal and boring as you're ever likely to get. Her big idea was to forgive student loans by forcing people into even bigger and more onerous and risky debt. Some real genius stuff right there. He wrote the crime bill, and she enforced it. The Democrats chose a guy who excited nobody but the hardcore base who would have voted for him anyways, and they ran him against the least popular president ever. Their only message was that Trump was worse, not that Biden was going to actually do anything good for us. You have not heard a single substantive plan from these people. Trump is a president who mishandled a global pandemic leading to excessive death and suffering, who oversaw locking kids in cages, is accused of sexual assault and rape by over 20 individual women, and was routinely photographed chumming around with noted pedophiles Epstein and Maxwell. Not to mention that he used divisive racist rhetoric to drive a massive wedge into an already divided country. Oh, and the economy crashed and tens of millions of Americans were unemployed or underemployed over the past 9 months. And Biden barely pulled it off while Democrats broadly lost on the down-ballot races. Against that guy I just described, against a goon like Donald Trump. If this matchup of old doddering fools doesn't convince you that we need a serious goddamn system change around here, I'm not sure what could. Here's what I predict from the administration of Joe Biden and the Pelosi-led House. They will do weak, half-assed shit that will get stuffed by McConnell and the Senate because I'm pretty sure that the Dems won't flip it. And instead of actually fighting back, they will just surrender because that's what Democrats do. They surrender. And even if the Democrats do manage a miracle Senate flip from the runoff elections, they won't get rid of the filibuster. They won't ignore the debt and deficit like the Republicans. They won't fight. They'll reach across the aisle and give up because they are weak cowards. And for everyone out there like, nuh-uh, just look back at Obama's 8 years and see for yourself. I really hope that you did not get your hopes up, dear listeners. Friends have said to me, back Biden, and then you can push him left once he's elected. This is patent nonsense, of course. He got what he wanted. Why would he ever move? The only way to move him left is at the point of a bayonet, and sadly we don't have enough of those. But more on that in the coming weeks. Okay, now on to this episode's big idea. And before we really kick off this segment, I want to talk about this series of episodes that I'm doing based around the concept of freedom. I really should have done this in episode 15, as that is actually part 1 of the series, but I just kind of dropped the ball on that, and I apologize. So this series, which are being produced under the title of Is This Freedom?, are meant to explore the very concepts of liberty and freedom itself. But even more important than the concepts of freedom and liberty, I am working on breaking down the narratives of freedom and liberty that we have, particularly in the United States of America. I believe that the American concepts of freedom and liberty are as incomplete and dogmatic as they are ingrained in our society, media, and culture. Now, this isn't to say that there is absolutely no truth in these uniquely American narratives, or that some other narrowly defined concept of liberty or freedom is any better. What I hope to do here is challenge some of the notions that we hold as American citizens, to break down some barriers and at least get people to question some of the ideologies that they hold so dear and hold on to so fiercely. Facts and alternative views be damned. Now, I might be 100% right, or partially right, or hell, maybe even totally wrong. Seriously, let me know what you think in the comments. I honestly do appreciate the feedback. But in the end, I will definitely challenge some assumptions, even many of my own, as I explore these ideas. The episodes in this series will not be contiguous. Some will appear back to back, some maybe one episode apart like this and the previous one are, and some might come weeks, a month, or even months apart. There is no set amount of episodes, nor any artificial limitation. The series will be ongoing, and they will arrive when they arrive, and when they arrive, they will be labeled as part of the series. Okay, before I really dig in here, I just want to talk about freedom itself and how we tend to think about it as Americans. Generally, we tend to equate freedom or liberty with nobody telling us what to do. We'd be free to do anything that we wanted to. We can organize in any way we'd like, associate in any way we'd like. And alternatively, we could be by ourselves or live communally or any of a billion other combinations and situations, so long as we didn't infringe upon or harm another person. But I think that we, as a society and culture, really fail to think through and understand exactly what we are suggesting when we talk about freedom in this way. I think we truly do fail to understand the inevitable shortcomings of this libertarian utopia so many of us wax poetic over. We talk about being free, but I don't think we fully understand what freedom is, and we kind of pigeonhole ourselves into this circuitous feedback loop of thought that never quite pans out how we hoped it would. And this is sort of the point of this series. To imagine not what might seem to set us free, but to try to imagine what actual freedom might actually look like. Now, I'm not sure that even after doing 5 or 10 or even 50 of these episodes, that I will be able to lay out, plan, construct, and articulate a path to absolute freedom. But I hope I can chop a path through some overgrown forest and help those on the path behind me. Work. Noun. An activity involving mental or physical effort done in order to achieve a purpose or result. Verb. Be engaged in physical or mental activity in order to achieve a purpose or result, especially in one's job. Do work. Now that's the dictionary definition of the word work. And I'm going to go with something a little bit different as I wade through this podcast. Work. Noun. Compulsory engagement in modern, highly structured, hierarchical, value-sucking charnel houses. Now that sounds more appropriate, doesn't it? Now, one reason why I felt the need to specifically define what I am talking about here is because I want to separate the definition that I created from a more general use of the word work. For instance, I don't want my use of the word work here in this episode to be misinterpreted as including things like building a deck in your backyard or cleaning your room. I don't even want to conflate it totally with job on an extremely broad level. Not all jobs are what I defined back there. So if you feel like my definition does not apply to you in your interaction with the workplace, I totally understand. I only ask that you try to keep my definition in mind as you listen to this podcast. I am arguing that work, as I defined it, as an oppressive, life-sucking charnel house, exists for the vast majority of people. Hard work builds character, says every dad ever. Here's what I say. Modern work and employment is a sneakily harmful phenomenon. It is both authoritarian and intrusive in our lives. It is, perhaps, the most obtrusive aspect of modern society and normally reigns as the single most dictatorial aspect of our existence. So ingrained in our society is modern work that the question, "What do you do?" has become shorthand for, "Please tell me how hard you work and in which profession so that I can make massive assumptions and know where to place you in the social strata." Our professions have become the filter through which we see other people and ourselves. We self-identify as our profession. I am a lawyer. I am a doctor. I am a plumber. I am a truck driver. Well, I actually do drive a truck for a living, but I am not a truck driver. I am a husband, a son, a brother, and a friend. At the root of it all, I am a human being. Driving a truck is just something I do because I must eat and house my family. Driving a truck is not me, and I am not that. How perverted have we become that a profession is a more important social signifier than father or wife? Work is, oddly enough, both one of the most internalized and deeply ingrained facets of our lives, and it is also the singularly most impersonal force we must deal with on a daily basis. Most people will listen to here and think, yeah, I agree, work sucks, but I have to work, right? Well, the difficulty we have in dealing with this odd dissonance is pretty telling. Even as I write this, I struggle with it. I work. It sucks. It eats up 3/4 of my waking life, Monday through Friday. It even takes up headspace both before and after work as I anticipate workplace nonsense in the morning and when I decompress at night. It eats up even more mental and emotional energy on the weekends as the occasional work thought brainworms into my mind and distracts me from the infinitely more important aspects of a full and happy life. Things like my family, friends, and my own personal well-being. We have, essentially, been co-opted into a system which requires us to rely on involvement with industrialized mass production for our own basic survival. How many people truly want to work as I defined it? How many of us do it simply to earn a living? Modern work does not build character. Modern work destroys bodies, minds, and souls. Modern work fractures families and friendships and community. And the time left over for most of us is insufficient to salve those wounds. Modern work is, quite simply, a particularly brutal madness which must end if our claims of caring about human happiness can be taken seriously in any way at all. Quote, I totally believe we should be living in a time of abundance. Think about what we need: housing, security, education for our kids. The amount of resources and work to do that is pretty small. I'm guessing less than 1%. The idea that everyone needs to work frantically to meet people's needs is not true. End quote. That quote is from Google co-founder and former CEO Larry Page. Perhaps the most poisonous aspect of work in the culture which exalts work ethic above all else, including the simple pleasure of simply not being at work, is the inhumane belief that those who don't work, sometimes with caveats to the old and feeble, do not deserve shelter or food or other basic needs. An idea this immoral can only be sustained societally and only enforced systematically and institutionally. I think that the most slavish followers of Ayn Rand's particularly insane vision of selfishness are the most bizarre examples of this mindset. The Rand philosophy is best, or at least most popularly, laid out in her horribly written novel, Atlas Shrugged. I don't want to belabor how bad Ayn Rand's writing was, but it was really, really terrible, and we shouldn't pretend otherwise. Nor should we let a mention of her books go by without exclaiming how truly awful her prose was. I feel very strongly about this. And that's not even to mention how fundamentally evil, destructive, and sociopathic her philosophy is. In Atlas Shrugged, we find the presumptive hero, Dagny Taggart, a super efficient, industrious young woman who hadn't taken a vacation for several years before the story starts. We find out that the last vacation she took was a month's vacation many years ago, but she came back after just 1 week to continue working. What a hero. Other characters spend great bouts of stilted dialogue, which is always a little too on the nose, expressing how they would rather die than stop working and flagellating themselves for that vacation they took 6 years ago or for spending time with friends. You know, like a well-rounded human being would. Now, this is all a minor sidetrack, I have to admit to you, but I think it's important to focus on the philosophy that drives so many to worship at the altar of selfishness and capitalistic production over human happiness. In Rand's Atlas Shrugged world, selfishness is good, but only a certain type of selfishness. Selfishness which produces. Selfishness which makes industry more efficient and drives profit and consumption is the only good kind. In her world, selfishness drives the idea of work-centered lives as the be-all, end-all of a well-lived life. In her world, selfishness, as she defines and expresses it, should be the default mode for everybody in the world. And here's an interesting point to all this. When I say that her brand of selfishness is only that of a certain type, the type that drives production and profit, I mean that it necessarily, definitionally, turns every other form of selfishness bad and evil and undesirable. If someone were to be selfish in a way which expressed itself as, self-care, as an example, like maybe not working or taking a vacation or perhaps even making time for their family, then to Ayn Rand, that's bad. Because for her, it isn't truly selfishness that's good, but just that one certain type of selfishness. And I'm repeating that again because it's super important to understand this definitional conflict within her work. It's all selfish, all profit. We should have no enjoyment nor celebrate any goals beyond what is derived from our workplace and coldly collecting wealth. And just a quick note here, just in case anyone listening is a Randian type of libertarian and they are cartwheeling around their home or office with their hair on fire, I'm not saying that human beings shouldn't strive, struggle, and aspire. Of course we should. I do. I strive and work and struggle to improve. I just don't make work my life. I work because I need to eat. I don't glamorize it or fetishize it. I just recognize the pointless, unnecessary, superfluous inhumanity of it all. In the end, despite what Ayn Rand and her later sycophantic brainwashed toadies would insist, slavery to profit and labor is not freedom. Shit, it's not even desirable. It does not make for happy people. In its core, this is a deeply sick ideology. So let's just take the story of the Australian company Versa as an example here. They cut their work week to 4 days. They get Wednesdays off as well as Saturday and Sunday, all while still paying their employees the full 5 days salary they earned before the cut. The policy was implemented in 2018 and was going strong at least into the beginning of 2020. which is where the latest stories I can find were written. In the first year, revenue at the Australian company increased by 46% and profits nearly tripled, said its CEO and founder Kath Blackham. Blackham, however, was reluctant to fully credit only the 4-day workweek with the entirety of the performance. Quote, "We win work because we're known for having great work," end quote. And she added that the fact the agency has very low turnover and consistent teams working on briefs can be hugely appealing for potential business partners. But in the end, Versa's workers are happier, more productive, and the company is more profitable. Imagine that. You help lift the millstone from the humans' backs, and they flourish as never before. And, importantly for business owners, they are able to focus while actually at work and truly appreciate the freedom they have been given to simply live life, to simply be free. That such a strong appreciation for the freedom to not work is felt so powerfully should be rather telling, I think. When we consider which rights we hold as human beings, how can we take that very concept of rights seriously if we, through societal and institutional pressure and guide rails, attempt to curtail a right as basic as non-exploited existence itself? If that most inherent right will not be fought for and upheld, then what other rights can we truly be said to possess? "Go earn a living, young man," said every adult ever to every child who turns 16. We are told, at least implicitly, that going out to work is the morally correct thing to do, so we go. We show up and we sacrifice our time, the single most precious and valuable thing we possess outside of our physical form, in exchange for wages. We expend at least half of our waking lives in this pursuit, and we arrive home physically, mentally, and spiritually exhausted. With numb minds and degraded bodies, we shower, eat, and flop ourselves down on the couch for another Netflix binge session. If we are lucky enough to have found a soulmate, they flop down next to us in a similar state of physical and emotional distress. And this is not laziness or lack of good moral character. It's all the energy that we have left in us after capitalist hubris via our work has finished extracting its tribute. Society has pressed upon us an expectation that we must continue this cycle. We see others waking just as early and working just as late, and we succumb to the false consensus problem. We see the wan faces around us as they shuffle to work, shuffle at work, and shuffle home from work. We watch others grind themselves into bone meal upon the grist mill of modern work, and we begin to wonder how we could be any better than they are. We think those people would judge us if we just clocked out and went home. They are looking at you and feeling the same way. So we all continue zombie-like, cult-like, and waste away our life essence under the flickering fluorescence until we can go home and watch 2 episodes of a sitcom while we shovel food into our faces before we pass out. When can we just be human beings in this system? Part of me is just like, fine, I need to make some money so I can buy food and not die. But at least give me time to talk to my wife and play with my dogs, for fuck's sake. Give me some time to let some of that accrued workplace bitterness abide before I have to go back in. And I know that there are at least a couple of people out there like, just beat the system. Figure a way to step on enough people so you don't get stepped on anymore. Work 20 hours a day for 30 years and retire a little early. I mean, I disagree with a lot of that sort of mindset for various reasons, but primarily because, once again, this is an individualistic solution to a systemic problem, and those never work. I don't think we should look at a corrupt, lopsided game and devise a clever way to move ourselves to the favored side and pretend like this is a good thing. If we are playing Monopoly with 10 people, and 9 of us start with $50 and the 10th guy starts with $1 million and controls the bank, we shouldn't praise the one who connives his way to $500,000 and a stake in the bank while the rest of us each has $10. The 9 players with the $50, they should hit that 10th player with our pewter playing pieces right at the beginning. And we should keep hitting him until he plays by more egalitarian rules and we all get a chance to play and maybe even have some fun along the way. As an interesting historical side note for those who don't know, Monopoly was originally inspired by a game called the Landlord game, which was created to expose how unfair and immoral a lot of our systems are, including land grabbing and landlording itself. And listen, I'm not here to tell you that I have the key to some free of work utopia, or even that one exists or is likely to exist. There will always be need for labor, no matter how we slice it up, unless perhaps we find some source of free, limitless energy and eventually have robots building robots and so on. But that is not in the near future. There will always be stuff to do. There will always be work in the purest form of the word, like in a dictionary definition I quoted at the beginning of this episode. But the oppressive charnel houses of profit and despair? I think we can move past these outdated concepts and move on to more humane systems. Quote, Simone was bone tired. I didn't blame her. She was the model of a 21st century micro-entrepreneur, which is to say she was a grossly exploited worker. End quote. Corey Payne, from the book Live, Work, 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 Die, A Journey into the Savage Heart of Silicon Valley. Our very life flows directly into the markets as we exchange our time on this planet for our own little hoard of life credits. Meanwhile, almost all of the extracted value gets sucked up to the top of the hierarchy, and a few meager credits dink and dunk into our pockets. If this is living, and this is earning it, count me out. Enter the workforce, they tell us. Be productive. The most kind translation of this is work more, get paid less, and be happy about it. 85% of men work more than 40 hours per week. 65% of women work more than 40 hours per week. This averages out to 130 more hours than workers in Japan, 260 more hours than workers in Germany, and a shocking 500 more hours of work than those in France. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the average productivity of American workers has increased 400% since 1950. Yet wages have remained largely flat since the 1970s. This increase in productivity should have either been met with concurrent rises in wages or less work. We should be retiring sooner as well, yet this does not happen. Why? Because the mega wealthy and corporations have so thoroughly corrupted the system. Unions have been systematically destroyed, and they are currently being destroyed by the Trump administration, and they will continue to be destroyed well into the future due to Trump's Supreme Court picks. They have essentially removed nearly all worker side power from the equation. Healthy amounts of work, enough material goods, and help for the sick and elderly are well within reach. Yet none of those things are actually here. We need to ask why. Over time, we allowed ourselves to be convinced that we should disaggregate wages from value produced. Now, this next part might not sound like that difference between the two situations is as fundamental or insane as it actually is, but the difference is actually both massive and stark. And here it is. We now sell our time by the hour rather than our labor for a portion of the value we create. This decoupling might seem trivial at first, but it is incredibly important. By doing this, we have commodified our very life essence and our very limited time on this planet. The value-time commodity issue isn't just pedantic. It blurs and obfuscates the true value of our labor. We as citizens have been changed into a weird amalgam of worker and consumer above all else. Existence itself is internalized as work, buy, die. This is not freedom. We feel guilt if we don't comply with that 3-word definition of life. Work, buy, die. This is not freedom. And then we judge others who, quote unquote, fail to accept this definition. Those who don't work or don't feed off of the labor of those less fortunate than themselves are deemed lazy. They are, according to prescribed society, in a weird way, also greedy and selfish. Greedy because they prioritize a fully realized life over oppressive work or immoral rentiering. While I might say that these people are free, society calls them layabouts, malingerers, or parasites. And when enough people take that view and cast that aspersion, the targets of such attacks begin to believe it as well. We create a caricature that reinforces our societal training. That action helps buttress the false consensus problem we talked about earlier. After all, if not working 60 hours per week makes you a loafer, then we must work 60 hours per week so that we can feel productive and not be seen as a loafer. The toxic feedback loop only intensifies as this induced anxiety eats at us. If idleness is bad, then being productive is good. And if the only acceptable definition of productivity is work, and everything which is not work, like recreation, art, love, reading fiction, if that's all lost productivity, then the answer to alleviate the guilt of simply living is to work. To always be productive. To always work. Recently, my generation and younger, and I'm 42 years old, has begun to be advised, because retirement is increasingly unrealistic for most of us, to work until you're over the age of 70. As if that's a humane answer. Work, 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 die. Oh, actually, you know what? Could you work a little bit more? You wouldn't want to be lazy, would you? Besides, the economy really needs it. We can't sustain this perpetual growth without you. Is this what we are calling liberty and freedom? I guess what I think this comes down to is an ethical and moral situation. Or maybe it would be more accurate to call it an issue of empathy. I'm talking about the ability to look at a struggle and put ourselves into it. To see these struggles and battles and become part of them, even if they are not directly our own struggles or battles. This can be incredibly difficult for a people who have been so incredibly divided by an ideology of absolute individualism like we have been in the United States. Last episode, I used a Eugene Debs quote, and I'm going to use it again here. Quote, "While there is a lower class, I am in it. And while there is a criminal element, I am of it. And while there is a soul in prison, I am not free." End quote. What he meant by that is that he would always identify and enter into these battles, whether they directly affected him or not. This is what we call solidarity. While we are not unified, we are beginning to be expected to work until we die. And if that might be a little bit of hyperbole, then at least until we are close to death. So close to death that we can't ever really enjoy those years after we retire as old, broken beings. Worse yet, a human life is often considered a waste, if not spent in unending drudgery. How remorselessly sad that is. How unlike actual freedom any of this is. Now I'm going to read here, it's a little bit of a long quote, but it's from a book called Dying for a Paycheck by Jeffrey Pfeffer. Quote, "Employing a model designed to reduce the likelihood of double counting, Go, Xenios, and I estimated that the number of total excess deaths each year attributable to the 10 workplace conditions was about 120,000 people. To put this number in perspective, this is more deaths coming from poor, unhealthful, stressful workplace conditions than the number of deaths resulting from diabetes, Alzheimer's, influenza, or kidney disease, and about as many deaths as were reported in 2010 from both accidents and strokes. The data on deaths by cause came from the Centers for Disease Control." End quote. Well, that's just how it is, we are told. But this is wrong. What has been happening to us is that we have been repeatedly and constantly fed a supposed choice. Work or be homeless and hungry. Work or die. This isn't a choice. This is a false dilemma. Those who posit this question always do it as an either or. You choose work or you choose homelessness and hunger and probably even an early death. Oh, and if you choose homelessness, these same people will advocate for the state to destroy your shelter, steal and destroy your belongings, and kidnap you and hold you against your will if you dare to try to exist where they can see you. That's how much you will mean to them. This is absolutely a false dilemma issue. A false dilemma is when a situation is presented as having only two possible solutions, but other solutions actually exist. There are other options. Universal basic income is the first thing that jumps into my head. Monthly or weekly payments that everyone receives, no matter their situation. Some form of guaranteed housing, perhaps. And no, I don't have intricate plans for all of this stuff, but they exist. Instead of presenting the country with false dilemmas and accusations of moral failings on those who fall outside of the so-called norms, let's actually make this country a better place. It's not exactly difficult to think of alternatives. We just need to find within ourselves the will to figure this out and implement them. Disentangling healthcare from our work is another idea that would help here, so all citizens, whether housed or not, can take care of their personal health. This does not have to be how everything is. Modern work is literally killing us. Work-induced stress is related to multiple health concerns. It has been connected to such issues as diabetes, cardiovascular and circulatory diseases, and other issues. Emotionally, long work hours, chronic work-related stress, and constant anxiety over benefits and job loss are destroying individual souls as well as entire families and communities. I'm going to read here from an article I found at The Guardian. Quote, researchers from University College London compiled data on the relationship between working hours and heart attack risk in over 600,000 workers, as well as similar data on stroke risk in over 500,000 workers. They adjusted their data to compensate for individual workers' differences due to health behaviors such as smoking, alcohol consumption, and physical activity, and also adjusted for the presence of other cardiac risk factors such as high blood pressure, diabetes, and high cholesterol. They found that those who worked more than 55 hours per week had a 13% greater risk of heart attack and were 33% more likely to suffer a stroke, compared with those who worked 35 to 40 hours per week. End quote. The significance of work-related health issues cannot be overlooked or understated. Being overworked is, to say it plainly, killing us. At first, the thing that bothered me most about this was how cruel it all seemed. This cruelty can be associated directly with profit, I think. After all, avarice is easy to understand when all is said and done. But why do we accept it so readily? Could it be the seemingly arbitrary nature of it all? I don't believe it is a grand conspiracy. It seems more likely it is simply a lot of people behaving poorly at the top and putting ever-intensifying pressure on those below them. And if it isn't a grand conspiracy, then it must be systemic. Modern management as destroyer of life, I suppose. What else can we expect when firm performance is considered more important than worker health and happiness? I blame Milton Friedman, my favorite of all the villains in my own personal rogues gallery, for this, as he popularized the notion that corporations owe singular allegiance to their investors and not the communities that they serve. Now, as we start to wrap this up, I want to address something. I don't have a perfect answer to this situation. I just don't. I do, however, have some ideas I'd like to explore in upcoming episodes that may help us work some of this out, even if we never discover some form of free energy or some other sci-fi shit to save us. Things like Medicare for all, which we talked about in part 1 of this series, but we'll dive into further very soon, I hope. And things like modern monetary theory, universal basic income, and, as paradoxical as it may sound after this episode, job guarantees. Sure, you're free to pursue happiness, they will tell us before they clarify their meaning. Just make sure that your path is paved with work. In other words, we are free so long as we don't try to climb the fence which imprisons us. We work and we hate it. We work and we do not value it. We allow ourselves to be taken from those we value the most, our families, in pursuit of this folly. We convince ourselves that we must do this because work is the only way that human beings can find purpose in the world. And that is an old canard we like to tell ourselves so that we don't ever try to improve our own happiness, that without work we can find no purpose. And that's a damn lie. Modern work is not some mandatory spiritual experience without which we would die of nihilistic shock. This is nothing more than a pervasive fairy tale passed off as truth. Work is just work. We do it because we must in our current reality. Few people would choose this tediously destructive path if they were not forced upon it. Work is not happiness. Happiness is outside of work. Fulfillment is found with our families and our friends. Life should not be reduced to brief snatches of time on the weekends. A life not spent in perpetual toil is not a life wasted. In fact, such a life is a life well lived. Modern work is not freedom. Clearly, we must stop being ashamed of this very simple idea. And thank you guys for listening. This is the end of the episode. Please, like, subscribe, leave a review. Don't be afraid to give 5 stars on Apple. Reviews and ratings on Apple are like the